All right, hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Airbus 320 Tech Talk. What do all those buttons do? Thank you again so much for joining me. The topic of today's discussion is going to be the fuel synoptic page on the status display on the A320 flight deck. But before we get started, as always, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, please go ahead and hit the like button for me, hit subscribe, hit that notification bell, leave comments down below, all that kind of good stuff. It just helps me keep this channel moving forward and hopefully keeps this fun, engaging, and exciting for everybody that's interested in watching out there. So thank you if you've already done so. I really appreciate that. So we're going to go ahead and bring up the slide and jump in and talk about the fuel page here like we said. So as with what I mentioned in the last couple discussions there, I'm going to try to keep it brief and just focus mainly on the symbology here without going into too much in-depth detail about the fuel system as a whole. If you want a little bit more insight on that, you can go back and watch some of the previous videos. Maybe more specifically, you could watch the video that I did on the fuel pump switches on the overhead panel. We talked a little bit more in depth. But as always, if you have some detailed questions, please leave them down in the comment section there, and I'll try to do my best to field them for you. So we'll just go ahead and start at the very top here. So we have the first things we see up here, the number 1 and the number 2. As you might have guessed, that just specifies the number 1 and the number 2 engine. So down from there, we see a number on the left and right side here. And this is just the fuel quantity that's been used since we started this most recent flight cycle, let's say. So when you get on the ground and you shut both the engines down, the system knows that everything's kind of resetting. And when you start the engine on the next successive cycle, all this stuff zeroes out and it starts a new count. So as with everything on the Airbus, it just knows where it's at and what it's doing at all points in time. So it's very, very logical in that sense. So this just, like we mentioned, on this most current or recent flight segment, just shows us how much fuel we've used since we've started that first engine once again. And it's interesting here too, this is a very normal indication that we would expect to see. You'll see that the fuel used on the number 1 side is a little bit more in quantity than the number 2 side. And if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense. Every time we single engine taxi the airplane, we do it on the number 1 engine. So remember, we have these cases where we might push back from the gate and we anticipate a long taxi out to the runway, and maybe there might be a lineup or a reason to delay the second engine start for a period of time. And of course, we're just doing this to save fuel if we can get away with it. So like I mentioned, this is exactly what happened to us on this day. So we had started the number 1 engine, and there was a little bit of a delay from when we started the number 2 side there. So there is why you see the little bit of the difference in the quantities that we've burned up to this point. And then in the middle, just as the 1 plus 2 would imply, this is just the total fuel that's been used on this flight operation once again. So pretty simple, straightforward there. Moving down and to the left, we have an APU depiction here on a little white triangle. And of course, as you might have guessed as well, this just means the APU fuel pump. And remember, the APU has its own dedicated fuel pump that'll actually come on automatically if the system determines that it's not getting fuel pressure from the wing tank pumps here on the left side or the left center tank pump. So as with everything on the Airbus, it's automated. We don't really have any direct control, so to speak, over turning this pump on and off. Once again, the times when you'll see this running, and that depiction would of course be indicated by a green, or the icon here anyway is changing from white to green. Would be the case when we're sitting at the gate and we have the fuel pumps on the overhead panel, or the switches anyways in the off position, so they're not providing any pressure, they're not doing anything for us. The APU can start up and sustain itself running with its own APU pump there. So that's just all that tells us. In the middle here, we have a little circle. This just indicates the cross-feed valve, or the position of it. So remember, we have this valve that's put into the system that allows us to feed fuel to the opposite side's engine from the respective opposite side fuel tank. So remember, there's not necessarily a means that while we're flying or operating the airplane, or anyways for us as pilots, to transfer fuel physically from tank to tank. It is possible to get fuel to transfer between the tanks only when the airplane's on the ground and it's part of the refueling capabilities of the airplane. So it's something that can occur, like we said, when the fuel truck is hooked up and they're pumping gas into the airplane. This is part of the functionality that's built into the system. But for us as pilots, we don't actually have this means to, like we said, physically take fuel out of one tank and put it into another. So the best we can do for ourselves is to allow for a cross-feed operation where, let's say we did get some sort of fuel imbalance which can happen from time to time for a number of reasons. We're able to basically turn off the pumps on one side of the system, open up the crossfeed, and it allows both engines to be fed from one side of the system. And this has the effect, of course, of balancing everything out for us. And then when the operation is done with, we turn the crossfeed valve to the off position, and everything is back in its normal state, so to speak, where the left side is feeding the left engine and the right side feeding the right engine, very simply. I hope that makes sense for you guys. Down from there, we just have these boxes here that just indicate electric fuel pumps, essentially. So we have 2 of these pumps in the left wing tank. There's 2 in the center tank, and there's 2 in the right tank here. So of course they just they back one another up. They're there for redundancy. They are more or less always on when we're flying the airplane in a normal case. So you'll just see them in these positions here. And one thing to point out also, it's pretty apparent when you just look at these, but we can tell at this point in time where we're at in our flight, we have no fuel remaining in the center tank. So these pumps with the horizontal dash in the box here just means the pump is off, so it's not doing anything for us. And then of course the ones on the left and right side respectively, the little line is in a vertical orientation. It just means the pump is on and providing pressure and doing its normal thing for us. So down from there, we kind of touched on it already, but these of course are the quantities in pounds or kilograms if the airplane is set up to function in that measure. But we can see up here just an affirmation that our airplane, of course in the United States, they're set up to run in the pound system, so you see pounds here. But of course aircraft in other parts of the world might be running on kilograms, so you would see this depiction there. But like we said, just the quantity is depicted on the bottom here, so you can see just the general distribution of where the fuel is at for this given point of our flight where we're at. And one thing to tell you a little bit also about the general fuel feed plan on the A320 is that anytime we have fuel in the center tank, that the airplane knows that it always wants to extract the fuel out of the center tank first. So it'll burn all that out of there initially, and then when the center tank is depleted, it'll burn both the wing tanks down. Now these will go down in quantity till we get to a level of 1,650 pounds in the left and right wing tanks. And when that happens, there is these little valves that will open up in the outboard portions of the tank there, and it'll allow the fuel to basically just by gravity, it'll flow down into the main tank here and fill it back up to just whatever level equates to the fuel that had been remaining. Just allow us to burn the remaining amount or the remaining quantity of fuel out of the tanks there for the remaining portion of our flight. So just to back up also, to give the basic explanation about why they situated the system in such a way. They just want to leave some amount of weight out at the outboard portions of the wing, and this is just like a structural kind of relief thing for the airplane to allow for just like some balancing to be done aerodynamically, or not aerodynamically, but just to say physically, in the form of you have this extra weight of gravity just hanging out at the wings there, so they're not bending up unnecessarily as the weight of the airplane changes and all this kind of stuff. So kind of a structural thing. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So just the quantities there, very simple and straightforward. And like I kind of mentioned a moment ago, one of the biggest reasons that we'll come to this fuel page when we're cruising around is just to check the balance in the fuel tanks. As I said, we're always just trying to monitor this and look out that we're not getting too out of balance on any one side. There's of course a limitation that says we can't take off and land the airplane above a certain out of balance quantity comparison between two tanks. So we're always just looking out for that. And like I said, it's one of the biggest reasons that we'll come to this page when we're cruising around, just to monitor that and check that out. Below there, we just have some temperature indications. These are just the fuel tank temperatures themselves. And there's actually, interestingly enough, there's a limitation as well that we're not supposed to operate the airplane in a place that brings the fuel temperatures themselves down below a certain mark. And I think I'd have to look it up to get the specifics. I'm pretty sure it's negative 40 degrees Celsius for us in the A320 there. So it's very cold temperature. It is kind of rare that you would see the fuel get down to this point here. And you can see, at this point in time, I think we'd been cruising around for maybe an hour and a half when I took this photo here. And you can see that, it's probably around negative 40 or so static air temperature outside the airplane at this specific point in time. You can see the fuel temperatures are, respectively quite a bit warmer than that. So just an interesting thing to point out. Down below there, we just have the fuel flow between the number 1 and 2 engines in a pounds per minute readout here. And this is not something that we're always. I would say most of the time we're not making a reference to this much at all. We have several tools on the airplane to tell us, how much fuel we're burning and where we expect to be, at a certain point of time with a certain amount of fuel. And, we're always looking out for this to make sure that we have what we're supposed to have. We're also checking out, that's one thing I should say also from a high level standpoint. I mean, we're monitoring our fuel burn every time we go anywhere just to, guard and look out for the case of a fuel leak. Actually, you would notice this, by comparing the quantity that remains in the tank to where you are, once again, at your specific point in time over what, point of navigation or whatever that's been laid out ahead of you as part of the normal flight plan. We're always looking and watching out for these things. So, but what I wanted to mention about the fuel flow itself is that it's of course always changing as the engines are spooling up and spooling down and consuming different amounts of fuel for a given power output, let's say. But one thing that I do want to mention is one thing we're taught is kind of like a very very base level, very rudimentary number to keep in our brains if we're ever in a pinch and we're trying to figure out how much fuel is left in the airplane and how much time we can basically stay airborne. We're a very rough number, like I said, that we keep in our minds is 100 pounds per minute. So roughly, 6,000 pounds per hour. This is a very handy mental thing to kind of keep in the back of our minds. Like I said, if we are in a case where, we're having to think about this, maybe we're having to divert somewhere, or we're in some sort of emergency. We just need to know, how much longer can we fly this airplane with this given amount of fuel that we have on board. So one little thing to mention there. And then the final one, just the fuel on board here is depicted at the bottom of the screen. Remember, we always have the fuel on board depicted on the main engine and warning display screen. It's the top one in the center of the captain and the first officer there that we're always looking at, and just kind of paying attention to our total fuel state on board the airplane. So I hope all that stuff makes sense for you guys. As always, if you have some more questions, please leave them down below. I'll do the best job that I can to field them for you. So with that being said, I did have another viewer write in with a question, so I'll try to do my best to field that for him. So this is from Lee Ricky FSX. Once again, Ricky, you've been one of my dedicated viewers for a long time. I really appreciate you still tuning in, and I'm glad that you're getting something useful out of all these talks. So thank you once again for that. But Ricky's question here, he asks, kind of unrelated to the last technical talk that we did, but he had a question. It says, how do the pilots know when to speak on the air traffic control? When I tried the simulation software called VATSIM with multiplayer ATC, every time I wanted to speak, somebody else is speaking. What about in real life? So this is a good question. A couple things come to mind. I hope I'm answering the actual question that you're curious about, Ricky. And if I'm not, please give me some more details about what you're curious to know. But like I said, a couple things come to my mind. With something like VATSIM, you probably have a huge abundance of players or folks that are participating at the same point in time. So right off the bat, imagine, in real life, a given parcel of airspace, that's controlled by one controller. He might be talking to 10, 15, maybe 20 airplanes at one point in time. So by contrast to the VATSIM scenario, there's just physically less people on the frequency at any point in time that need to be talking. So I imagine if you go on VATSIM, I haven't looked at this stuff in a long time. I actually used to tinker around a little bit this a long time ago when I was more into flight simming. But there's probably 50 or 100 people maybe participating at the same point in time. So just the sheer volume of people trying to chime in and trying to make a radio call right off the bat, I could understand why for you and your perceptions, you're thinking, my gosh, how do all these people, how does this stay orderly, or how do they know, who to talk to, when to talk to, all this kind of stuff. So that, I would say, is somewhat unrealistic when you go in the VATSIM world, and to try to compare that to the real world. That's just the point I'm trying to make, Ricky, is that right off the bat, the volume is totally different. So there's just not as many people that need to speak at any one point in time. And the other thing that I can say is that, very, very simply, it kind of sounds, maybe silly, but in the real world, it's, the general rule is that like you'll speak when you're spoken to. So when the controller needs you to do something or say something, they'll actually queue up and they're kind of in command of calling out, who they want to talk to, when they want to talk to them. So it kind of keeps everything orderly in that sense that, pilots aren't just, I shouldn't say always, but for the most part, once you kind of get underway and you get going, they're only talking back when they're being talked to. So only when they're asked to do something. So a frequency change or a heading change, an altitude change, a clearance change, all this kind of stuff, it's being directed by the air traffic controller themselves. So they're calling out for you when they need you. And of course, there are some exceptions to this rule. When you're on the ground, you're making your first call to try to taxi out, or, even if you're airborne, if you need a revised clearance, or you need assistance, or you need to do something different, there is a time when you might, key up the mic and you might have to talk without being talked to. But as with everything else, you just wait for a break in the airwaves, and you key up the mic and you make your call when you have a chance to get in. And most of the time, like I said, there is a relatively low volume, and there's plenty of free airspace time to just jump in and make said what you need to be said. But there are some interesting times also, though, where I see, like, especially this happens a lot on the ground at very busy airports during peak hours. Like I remember, multiple times taxiing out of LAX airport, and like everybody is trying to call the ground controller to get their clearance to taxi out. You have these banks of time where just for some reason all the airlines schedule their flights. They all want to leave around a certain point in time, so everybody's trying to call up at the same time. You have guys like stepping all over each other, and it gets pretty disorderly pretty quickly, and it can be a little frustrating for everybody that's on the airwaves, all the pilots, and especially the controllers. There are some times where I don't know, you might experience a little bit of what you're seeing in VATSIM, but I will build on top of that, and there are certain ways that the controllers will actually mitigate the overabundance of people that are on the airwaves at the same time. They'll actually break up the frequency, let's say. So the case of LAX ground, when things are getting very busy, they actually have two frequencies that they can break up and use, to talk to different planes on different frequencies. Of all the traffic they would normally talk on the one dedicated frequency, they kind of have a backup one that they can tell, like, half of the people trying to call in, hey, all you guys, like, go on to this frequency, call me here, you other guys stay here, and keeps things a little bit more orderly. So it's kind of the ways that you can get two controllers to split up all that work. Makes it a lot better, a lot smoother, a lot cleaner running for everybody. The other way that I've seen this mitigated, some airports, I remember Salt Lake City Airport used to do this, and I don't know why these procedures are different from airport to airport. And if there's any controller types out there that are watching, I'd love to know the answer to this, because it seems like some facilities have these things figured out, and it just runs like so much smoother. But the example that I'll give you is, like I said, at Salt Lake City Airport, when it got very busy, they would put on the ATIS that all you would do is like taxi out to your holding point with your transponder on, of course. And at every modern airport, the controllers actually have a display in the tower where they can see, like, through your transponder code, they can see where you're at, they can see what your flight number is, all the data on you. So, without you having to key up the radio and say anything, you taxi over the spot, and the controller would come on the airwaves, and he was ready to talk to you, and he would say, okay, such and such airline at spot number 2, like, what's your request? Or, they knew, or you were trying to taxi out to take off or whatever, but it was just this really orderly fashion that they would call you when they needed you, so to speak. You didn't have to waste time just calling them as you would normally in most other places. So it was just a really efficient way of doing things, and it functioned beautifully. And like I said, I wish they would do more of that stuff at some of these bigger airports when it gets busy, but it just is what it is. So that's all I've got for you guys today. I really appreciate y'all tuning in. I hope everybody is staying healthy and happy and all that kind of good stuff out there in the midst of all the coronavirus stuff going around the world right now. So thanks again for tuning in, and we're going to talk again real soon. Bye-bye.